The road into the Appalachians does not announce itself. It thins, bends, and quietly forgets where it was meant to lead, pulling travelers deeper beneath a canopy of ancient trees where sunlight struggles to survive. The air grows heavier there, not with fog, but with something older, something that watches. Locals say the woods have a way of closing behind you, sealing off the world you came from. And somewhere beyond that point, hidden where compasses falter and maps go blank, lies a village that was never meant to be found. No official records name it. No signs point toward it. Yet stories persist, whispered low and only after dark, about a bloodline so corrupted that even the mountains tried to bury it. Families bound not by love, but by inheritance, passed quietly from parent to child like a curse wrapped in flesh. Children born with eyes too knowing, too empty. Smiles that arrived late, if at all. A silence that followed them, thick and deliberate. Those who claim to have seen the village describe homes pressed too close together, as if afraid of the surrounding forest, and a church bell that rings without rhythm, tolling for events that haven't happened yet. They speak of people who stare too long, who seem less interested in who you are than in whether you intend to leave. Most do leave. Some do not. And the ones who return never describe what they saw the same way twice, as if the memory itself refuses to settle. What makes the story unbearable is not the violence, though there was violence, but the devotion. The obedience. The way an entire bloodline learned to survive by embracing something unspoken and feeding it generation after generation. The evil was not sudden. It was patient. Rooted. Growing slowly in the dark soil of the Appalachians, waiting for the world to forget it ever existed. Long before the village earned its reputation, long before whispers of bloodlines and corruption, there was a simple mystery that unsettled everyone who lived near the mountains: the place did not officially exist. County maps showed a stretch of forest where roads clearly continued. Old survey documents referenced boundary lines that bent strangely, as if the land itself resisted being measured. Even federal records contradicted one another, listing abandoned homesteads with no names, then later erasing them entirely. To outsiders, it looked like a clerical error. To locals, it was a warning. People who grew up in the shadow of the Appalachians learned early which directions not to travel. Elders spoke carefully, lowering their voices when the conversation drifted toward the deeper woods. They never named the village outright. Instead, they used gestures, a nod toward the tree line, a pause that carried more meaning than words. It was understood that the place had been there longer than memory and that it preferred to remain unacknowledged. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to cross certain ridges. Surveyors complained that their equipment malfunctioned only in that region, needles spinning uselessly as if north itself had been lost. Occasionally, someone unfamiliar with the area would stumble onto the road leading inward. It was always described the same way: a narrow path that seemed to appear only after the last sign of civilization vanished. No markers. No mile counts. Just packed dirt and tire ruts that suggested regular use, yet no one could say by whom. Those who followed it too far often returned confused, insisting they had driven for hours without seeing a single landmark, only endless trees and the unsettling feeling of being watched. Some never returned at all, their disappearances explained away as accidents or poor decisions in unforgiving terrain. What made the mystery darker was that the village resisted discovery not through force, but through absence. No photographs survived long enough to be studied. Old aerial images showed blurs where buildings should have been. Mail sent toward that area came back undelivered, addresses smudged or marked non-existent. It was as if the land conspired with time to erase itself. People began to suspect that the village had learned how to hide, not just from authorities, but from history itself. The more officials tried to document the region, the less there was to find. Records vanished from archives. Witnesses contradicted one another. Roads that once led somewhere now led nowhere. And slowly, the idea took hold that the village was not lost at all, but deliberately withdrawn, waiting beyond the edge of recognition, intact and breathing, just out of sight, just out of reach, where forgetting was not an accident but a requirement, and those who came too close felt the pull of something ancient urging them to turn back before they remembered too much or crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, because once the village was acknowledged, once it was truly seen, it could know. longer pretend to be gone, and neither could those who had found it, and that was the part no map would ever show. The bloodline first revealed itself not through violence or confession, but through absence, through names that should have existed and did not. Family trees in neighboring towns showed branches that simply stopped, entire generations missing as if they had stepped out of time. Birth records listed infants with no fathers, sometimes no mothers, only dates and locations that circled back to the same unmarked stretch of forest. Death certificates were rarer still, and when they appeared, the causes were vague, repetitive, and strangely impersonal. It was as though the lives tied to that place were never meant to be examined too closely. Whispers began to surface among those who handled the records. Clerks noticed the same surnames reappearing decades apart, unchanged, untouched by marriage or migration. These names never traveled. They did not spread outward like most families did. Instead, they folded inward, looping back on themselves. Locals spoke of old blood, not with pride but with resignation, as if lineage itself had curdled into something unhealthy. Children born from these families were said to resemble ancestors they could not possibly remember, carrying expressions that belonged to another century. The rumor that something was wrong with the bloodline did not start in the village, but beyond it. Schoolteachers in nearby counties noticed children who arrived suddenly, stayed briefly, and vanished without explanation. They were quiet, watchful, disturbingly composed for their age. Their handwriting matched that of older relatives almost perfectly. Doctors who examined them remarked on unusual similarities in bone structure and eye shape across generations, traits that should have diversified but did not. When questions were asked, the families withdrew, returning to the woods without protest or explanation. What frightened people most was not deformity or madness, but consistency. Generation after generation produced the same emotional flatness, the same detachment from the outside world. It was as if something essential had been edited out of them long ago and replaced with something colder, more obedient. Stories circulated of family members who tried to leave, only to return months later hollowed out, speaking little, behaving as if escape itself had been punished. Over time, the idea took hold that the bloodline was not merely cursed, but designed. Not the result of one terrible act, but of many small decisions repeated faithfully. Isolation became inheritance. Silence became tradition. Whatever darkness first took root in the village was preserved through careful breeding, through a refusal to mix, through loyalty enforced not by chains, but by belonging. Those who whispered about it began to understand that the village did not survive despite its corruption, but because of it, and that the bloodline's greatest strength was its ability to endure unnoticed, to pass from parent to child without spectacle, without rebellion, like a secret carried in the body itself, waiting patiently for the world to look away long enough for it to continue unchanged. The first real fear did not come from what the children of the village did, but from how eerily similar they were. People noticed it slowly, in fragments, through brief encounters that felt wrong in ways that were difficult to explain. A child would stand too still, watching without curiosity. Another would speak in a voice too measured, choosing words carefully, as if reciting something learned long before it was understood. When families from the village appeared in nearby towns, their children moved together with quiet coordination, glancing at one another as if sharing thoughts that never needed to be spoken aloud. Teachers who encountered them described the same unsettling patterns. The children learned quickly, but showed no excitement when praised, no frustration when corrected. Their handwriting bore striking similarities, even across different ages, the same slanted letters and controlled pressure as though guided by a shared hand. When asked about their homes, they answered politely but vaguely, deflecting personal questions with practiced ease. Attempts to involve child welfare services were quietly abandoned after parents arrived, calm and unyielding, insisting on their right to leave, and somehow always succeeding. Doctors and nurses noticed the physical similarities next. Many of the children shared the same eye shape, the same fixed gaze that lingered too long before breaking. Medical charts from different years showed matching skeletal proportions and identical minor anomalies that should have disappeared through genetic variation but instead repeated themselves faithfully. Blood tests revealed nothing conclusive, yet physicians often wrote private notes describing an unshakable sense of unease during examinations, as if they were being evaluated in return. More disturbing were the moments when the children were alone. Campers in the woods reported hearing them sing softly at night, melodies that did not match any known song, rising and falling in slow, deliberate patterns. Others claimed they watched animals approach the children without fear, only to retreat suddenly, panicked, as if sensing something unnatural. A few witnesses described seeing the children stand in circles at dusk, motionless, heads tilted slightly inward, remaining there long after the light had faded. What truly terrified outsiders was not the presence of cruelty, but the absence of innocence. The children did not play the way others did. They did not imagine futures or speak of dreams. When asked what they wanted to be when they grew up, they answered simply, as if the outcome were predetermined. Leave, for them, was not an option. Growing older was not a journey, but an assignment. It became clear that the similarities were not coincidence or folklore, but design, carefully reinforced over generations until individuality itself had been worn down. Each child carried the same quiet weight, the same unspoken understanding that they were not meant to stand apart, only to continue, to watch, to wait, and to step seamlessly into the place prepared for them long before they were born. The stories about outsiders all began the same way, with curiosity overcoming caution. Hikers followed unmarked trails, hunters chased game too deep into unfamiliar territory, and travelers took wrong turns that seemed harmless at first. What united their accounts was not what they saw, but what they dreamed afterward. Nearly everyone who entered the deeper woods and returned spoke of the same night vision, though none of them had known each other or compared stories beforehand. The dream always placed them back among the trees, where the forest stood unnaturally still. No wind moved the branches. No insects sang. The silence pressed in until it became unbearable. Then the village appeared, not all at once, but in fragments, a porch light flickering without a house attached to it, a dirt road leading nowhere, the sound of a bell echoing without direction. Faces emerged next, watching from behind windows or between trunks, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. In the dream, the outsiders were never chased. No one raised a hand against them. Instead, they were invited to walk deeper, guided by figures who spoke softly, offering reassurance, promising rest. Those who tried to turn around found the path behind them gone, replaced by trees that had grown impossibly close together. The feeling was not terror, but surrender, a creeping sense that resistance was unnecessary, even foolish. Many described the moment they realized the dream was not urging them to stay, but teaching them how to return. When these people woke, the dream did not fade. It clung to them during daylight hours, resurfacing in reflections, in the sound of wind through leaves, in the smell of damp earth after rain. Some felt compelled to sketch what they had seen, only to destroy the drawings in frustration when the details refused to remain consistent. Others drove back toward the mountains without understanding why, stopping just short of the tree line before panic forced them to retreat. Not everyone came back. Search parties found abandoned campsites, vehicles left neatly on the roadside, supplies untouched. In a few cases, survivors were discovered days later, wandering in neighboring counties, dehydrated but unharmed, unable to explain where they had been. They spoke little after their return, responding to questions with rehearsed phrases, their personalities dulled, their memories fractured. Families noticed changes that could not be undone, as if something essential had been quietly removed. Over time, it became clear that the woods did not simply trap outsiders, but marked them. Those who escaped carried the village with them, spreading its presence through dreams and compulsions. The forest did not need to claim everyone who entered. It only needed a few to return, altered, carrying the echo of the place back into the world, ensuring that the boundary between the hidden village and the outside never fully closed, but remained thin, porous, and dangerously alive, waiting for the next curious soul to cross without realizing that the invitation had already been extended long before their feet touched the soil. The church was the only structure ever acknowledged by name, though no one could agree on where it stood. Some said it rose from the center of the village, others swore it was hidden just beyond the last house, half swallowed by trees. What gave it substance was not its walls or steeple, but a ledger that surfaced briefly in a county archive before disappearing again. It was an old book, its leather cracked, its pages yellowed and soft, catalogued simply as a donation record from an Appalachian parish that did not officially exist. At first glance, the entries seemed ordinary. Names, dates, offerings recorded in careful handwriting. But the longer one studied the ledger, the stranger it became. Entire families appeared again and again across decades, their surnames unchanged, their contributions identical in wording and amount, as if copied from an earlier page. Baptisms were recorded with precision, yet marriages were scarce, and funerals almost non-existent. Children were welcomed into the faith, but few were ever formally mourned, suggesting a cycle that did not end so much as continue elsewhere. More unsettling were the marginal notes. Written in a tighter, darker script, they referenced continuance, obedience, and preservation, terms that felt less like religious devotion and more like instruction. Certain dates were marked with small symbols instead of words, repeated every few years without explanation. A priest from a neighboring county once tried to trace the origins of these markings, but found no reference in any known doctrine. When he asked elders about the church, they denied its existence entirely, insisting he must be misreading the book. Those who studied the ledger closely began to notice another pattern. Generations overlapped in ways that defied normal time. A name listed as a child in one decade appeared as a witness years later, then reappeared again with no clear aging reflected in the handwriting. The ink changed, but the script did not. It was as if the same hand returned to the page repeatedly, wearing different skins. The implication was disturbing. The church was not documenting faith, but enforcing continuity, ensuring that nothing strayed from its intended path. When the ledger vanished from the archive, replaced by a blank space in the catalogue, those who had seen it felt a growing sense of dread. The book had not recorded belief in salvation or redemption. It had recorded compliance. Attendance without question. Ritual without understanding. The church, whatever form it took, was not a refuge from the darkness of the woods, but its extension, a place where secrecy was sanctified and silence elevated to virtue, binding each generation tighter than the last through ink, ritual, and an unspoken agreement that faith was never meant to save them, only to keep them exactly as they were meant to be. The land around the village seemed to have a consciousness of its own, reacting to the presence of outsiders with a subtle, almost imperceptible hostility. Hunters reported trails that led them in circles, no matter how carefully they marked their path. Compasses spun wildly, never settling on north, and GPS devices would either fail entirely or place them miles from any recognizable location. Animals behaved strangely as well. Deer and smaller creatures would vanish at the approach of humans, and dogs, usually reliable in scent and instinct, often refused to follow their owners into certain clearings, barking and growling at invisible threats. Even the weather seemed to bend to the village's will. Fog would descend suddenly, thick and suffocating, obscuring entire valleys. Storm clouds gathered in odd formations above ridges, then dissolved without rain. Summers could turn unexpectedly cold, and winters, while never breaking historical records, carried an oppressive chill that clung to clothing and skin. Locals learned to respect these anomalies, seeing them not as natural events but as signals, warnings of boundaries best left uncrossed. To venture too far was to invite disorientation, anxiety, and sometimes madness, for the land had a way of testing the resolve of those who did not belong. The trees themselves seemed alive in a way that defied explanation. They leaned toward intruders, closing ranks in groves that should have been open. Branches would snap without wind, and shadows fell in ways that made one feel observed, even when no one was present. Hikers and hunters spoke of hearing faint murmurs or whispers carried on the wind, voices that sounded almost human, yet distant and hollow. At times, the ground beneath their feet would feel uneven, as if shifting subtly, making familiar terrain feel suddenly alien. The forest did not strike with force. It simply made navigation impossible and endurance a test few could pass. Over time, a pattern emerged in these encounters. Those who were patient, respectful, and quiet often passed through the woods without incident, leaving behind only stories of eerie silence. Those who rushed, shouted, or trespassed recklessly found themselves lost, sometimes for days. They returned disoriented, speaking of loops that repeated endlessly, of places they had passed before but could not remember, of sounds and shapes that seemed alive. Some were never seen again, and their absence became another layer of the village's growing mythos. It became clear that the land was not merely a backdrop, but an active participant, shaping the experience of anyone who approached. It tested, it observed, and it rejected those who were unprepared. The forest, hills, and valleys acted as guardians, bending perception and logic to ensure the village remained hidden. It was not enough to follow a map or trail. To enter required understanding that the land itself was alive, watching every movement, every hesitation, every misstep, and that it could, with subtle precision, decide who might proceed and who would be swallowed by its unseen boundaries, leaving only fear and unanswered questions in its wake. The discovery of the old matriarch's grave sent a ripple of unease through the few who dared speak of it. Hidden deep within the forest, marked only by a rotted wooden cross that leaned at an impossible angle, it appeared ordinary at first glance. Yet something about it felt wrong, as if the earth itself was reluctant to give up what rested beneath. The soil above the coffin had been recently disturbed, but there were no footprints, no signs of human presence, nothing to indicate who or what had moved the earth. The forest around it was too quiet, the usual chorus of birds and insects conspicuously absent, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Locals who had lived near the village for decades hesitated even to approach it. They spoke in whispers of the matriarch, a woman whose life had shaped the course of the bloodline, whose influence had stretched far beyond the boundaries of her home. She was said to have understood the secrets of the village better than anyone, and even in death, it seemed as though she had left instructions behind, embedded in the land itself. Those who dared to linger near the grave reported sudden chills that penetrated clothing, a pressure in the chest, and an overwhelming sensation of being watched by eyes that belonged to no living person. Investigators who examined the site noted anomalies that defied explanation. The soil was loose in patches where it should have compacted over decades, as if the grave had been reopened and closed again, not by human hands, but by something deliberate and intelligent. Nearby plants showed unusual growth patterns, twisted and bent toward the mound, as though drawn to it. Even the air seemed heavier, tinged with a faint metallic scent that lingered long after leaving the area. Those who stayed too long spoke of whispers carried on the wind, voices murmuring words they could almost comprehend but never fully understood. The most disturbing accounts came from those who claimed to have glimpsed the matriarch herself in dreams or fleeting shadows. She appeared not as a corpse, but as a figure of authority, watching, correcting, guiding. Some said she extended an invisible hand, directing the living to certain paths while warning against others, her presence both protective and threatening. It became clear that the grave was more than a resting place, it was a marker, a focal point of power, a conduit between the village's living and its dead. It acted as a silent sentinel, ensuring the continuity of the bloodline and enforcing the invisible rules that governed it. The earth had rejected neglect and refused to remain still, reminding anyone who approached that the matriarch's influence had not ended with her body, that death was only another layer of vigilance, and that those who sought to uncover the village's secrets might awaken forces older and more watchful than they could comprehend. The survivor's confession arrived like a shadow in the daylight, quiet, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. They had returned from the village changed, carrying not scars but knowledge, a weight far heavier than any physical injury. They spoke reluctantly, their voice low, eyes darting as though the forest itself might be listening. What they revealed was less about what the village did in plain sight and more about what it demanded in silence. The bloodline's survival was not built on acts of cruelty, but on obedience, a devotion so thorough that questioning it seemed unthinkable. Every child, every adult, every elder was taught, from the moment they could walk and speak, that their role was predetermined, their choices an illusion. The survivor described rituals that were subtle yet pervasive. Meals, chores, even casual greetings followed patterns repeated for generations. Compliance was rewarded with inclusion, resistance was rarely punished openly but instead met with calculated omission, a withdrawal of attention that felt sharper than any blow. Children learned early that deviation invited consequences that were invisible yet absolute, like a door closing softly behind them, separating them from warmth, companionship, or the acknowledgement of their elders. The village had perfected a system of control that relied on instinct rather than coercion, teaching obedience as naturally as breathing. Even daily life reinforced the lessons. They spoke of schedules that were unspoken yet universally observed, tasks completed not because someone demanded them but because everyone knew they must be done. The survivor noted how individual thought was subtly shaped, how curiosity was redirected into acceptable channels, and how the community enforced conformity without overt confrontation. The children, the adults, even the elders internalized the expectations so completely that leaving the village felt not like escape, but betrayal of an unbroken lineage. The forest, the village, the very ground seemed complicit in maintaining order, shaping behavior with unseen hands. What disturbed the survivor most was the realization that this obedience was not imposed externally, it was inherited. From birth, every child was conditioned to accept the rules, the hierarchy, the rituals. Even instinct leaned toward submission. The more they observed, the clearer it became that survival, comfort, and identity were all contingent on adherence. The village thrived not because of isolation or fear, but because the bloodline had mastered the art of self-regulation, teaching the next generation to perpetuate itself willingly. The confession revealed a terrifying clarity. The village's power lay not in physical dominance, nor in outward cruelty, but in its capacity to make compliance natural, inevitable. It had learned to bind its people through loyalty rather than force, through understanding rather than intimidation, creating a cycle where the bloodline endured not by chance, but because every member was trained from birth to continue it unquestioningly, and the forest and mountains themselves seemed to approve of this quiet, relentless obedience. The continuation of the bloodline depended on rituals and isolation, practices so ingrained that they seemed as natural as breathing, yet carried the weight of centuries. From birth, children were separated from the outside world in ways both subtle and absolute. Education, socialization, even the stories they were told were carefully controlled, designed to reinforce obedience and conformity while discouraging curiosity about the larger world. Outsiders were rare, their visits fleeting, and every interaction was measured to ensure the preservation of tradition. The village did not rely on brute force to maintain its legacy, it relied on control that was invisible, woven into daily life so thoroughly that the inhabitants themselves rarely questioned it. Rituals were central to the community's endurance, but they were not always overt. Some took place at designated times, known only to certain elders, while others were embedded in ordinary routines. Morning meals, chores, and greetings carried layers of symbolic meaning. Even play had rules that reinforced hierarchy and obedience. The survivor described ceremonies where children learned to honor the bloodline itself, reciting names of ancestors and pledging loyalty to patterns of behavior dictated not by law or morality, but by the village's unseen logic. These acts, repeated with careful consistency, bound the generations together, creating a sense of inevitability that each child would grow into the life carved out for them before birth. Isolation amplified these effects. The forest surrounding the village acted as both shield and teacher, a natural barrier that filtered the world outside. Hunters and travelers who strayed too close rarely returned unchanged. Communication with the outside was limited and controlled, often mediated through trusted intermediaries or delivered in forms that concealed more than they revealed. Letters, visits, and trade were orchestrated so that the bloodline could exist in a bubble, impervious to interference yet still functional, still part of a broader world it only observed from a distance. The survivor emphasized how these practices shaped identity. Children did not rebel because they had no frame of reference for rebellion. Their understanding of life was inseparable from the village's expectations. Behavior, personality, even thought patterns were molded by generations of repeated instruction, reinforced by observation and subtle enforcement. Deviations were corrected not through punishment but through omission, withdrawal, or quiet disapproval, techniques that left no visible mark but instilled deep compliance. Over time, the combination of ritual and isolation ensured that the bloodline's continuity was nearly absolute. Each generation learned the rules intuitively, internalized the patterns, and passed them on to the next. What outsiders might see as oppression or cruelty was, in the eyes of the village, preservation. The survival of the family, the village, and the secret it carried was dependent on this carefully maintained system, a slow and deliberate inheritance that made the bloodline resilient, self-sustaining, and frighteningly untouchable. And the forest and mountains themselves seemed complicit in guarding the practices that ensured it endured. The most unnerving truth about the village was that it never truly died, never faded into memory or myth, and had perfected the art of hiding in plain sight. Generations came and went, yet the village remained intact, its presence whispered about in surrounding towns but never confirmed on maps or in official records. It was not merely a collection of houses or families, it was a living organism, shaped by the forest, the mountains, and the centuries of careful cultivation of secrecy. Every tree, path, and stone seemed to conspire in its concealment, guiding travelers away and erasing evidence of intrusion, ensuring that the village could persist without scrutiny. The survivor who spoke of it described an awareness within the village itself, a consciousness that extended beyond any single inhabitant. The community seemed to sense attention from outsiders, adjusting subtly, manipulating perception, and allowing only fragments of itself to be glimpsed. Houses appeared and disappeared depending on perspective, paths shifted, and familiar landmarks became unrecognizable when retraced. Even those who thought they had memorized the way in would find themselves lost, returning to the same spot repeatedly despite careful navigation. It was as if the village existed both in space and in a liminal zone, moving slightly to avoid detection yet anchored firmly to the land. Inside, life continued with the same patterns that had been followed for generations. Children were born, taught, and indoctrinated into the bloodline's unbroken chain of obedience. Elders guided them with rituals both subtle and deliberate, ensuring that the lessons of secrecy, loyalty, and survival were internalized before the outside world could interfere. Outsiders could witness fragments of the village's routines if they approached carefully, but nothing would ever reveal the full scope. Every element, the forest, the people, the rituals, worked in harmony to maintain the illusion that the village was a ghost, a story, a warning rather than a living, breathing reality. What made it more frightening was the realization that the village's concealment was active, intentional, and adaptive. It had learned from each intrusion, altering its patterns to prevent discovery, refining its ability to erase traces and confuse perception. Those who observed it could sense a presence that was always aware, always watching, yet never directly confronting. Even when an outsider managed to penetrate its perimeter, the experience left them altered, haunted by incomplete glimpses, memories that warped in the retelling, and an unshakable sense of being observed. The village did not need to attack, it needed only to survive, and it had done so with a patience and cunning that outlasted generations, wars, and time itself, teaching anyone who stumbled upon it that some secrets are preserved not through force, but through the careful mastery of absence, deception, and the quiet, relentless passage of enduring life hidden in plain sight.